Why was the P-38 Lightning an average fighter in Europe, but the US Army Air Force's best fighter in the Pacific? The P-38 has become a sought-after warbird even though it was not very successful over Europe. It's often quoted as having a low kill ratio around 1:1 and suffered issues with engine parts freezing, poor heating in the cockpit, and struggling against German aircraft in a dive. In the Pacific, it was a different story. The P-38 was the most successful fighter for the US Army Air Force against Japan. But how could a fighter that was phased out of frontline service in one theatre perform so good as a fighter in another? The P-38 was the first Army Air Force fighter to arrive in England in late 1942. They were used as bomber escorts and were the first fighter to escort bombers all the way to Berlin on March 3, 1944. But the new P-38 was plagued with mechanical and operational struggles. First, the early models had ineffective heaters in the cockpit, so the pilots would freeze at high altitudes. Frostbite was definitely a problem. Then there was issues with the parts of the engine freezing with the low temperatures causing engine failures. The P-38 suffered from loss of pitch control in a dive over a certain speed. The horizontal tailplane was straight, so the air would compress at the leading edge, blocking airflow over the elevator. This means if it tried to dive away from a 109 or 190, once it went over a certain speed, it lost the ability to pull out of a dive. Early bomber escort doctrine dictated that the fighters must stay with the bombers, which was a disadvantage for the P-38. Later on, the fighters were allowed to patrol ahead and attack the Luftwaffe as they climbed up to intercept. This shift in strategy is one of the reasons the P-51s were able to get much better results. The final factor working against the P-38 in Europe was it faced the most lethal, experienced and skilled pilots the Luftwaffe had. They were veterans from the Spanish Civil War, battles of France and Britain. The P-38 was going up against the best of the best pilots in aircraft optimised for high altitude intercepting, like the brutal Bf-109G. By the middle of 1944, most 8th Air Force fighter groups had converted out of the P-38s and into P-51 Mustangs, just as the skill of the average Luftwaffe pilot was dropping due to combat attrition and a poor pilot training program for replacements. Over in the Pacific, the P-38 started its combat in late 1942 and really came into its stride when the later models arrived in mid-1943. Lots of Japanese pilots were lost in 1942 with the sinking of carriers in the battles like Midway, but the skill gap was really noticeable towards the end of 1943. Fighting over the Solomon Islands and New Guinea took out combat experienced pilots, and the Japanese just couldn't replace them. So overall, the P-38 faced much less skilled enemy pilots in the Pacific than it did over Europe. The longer range on the P-38 made it an effective bomber escort compared to the P-40s and P-39s it replaced. The altitude the bombers operated was lower in the Pacific due to less flak. The air was warmer too, so there were less issues with the cold affecting pilots and the engines. The Japanese Zeros and Hayabusas had a decent power drop-off at altitude. Their climb rate over 10,000 feet was appalling compared to the P-38. They could easily outturn a Lightning, but by mid-1943 the boom and zoom tactics were well established. US Army Air Force pilots would dive at high speed and fire on the Japanese, then use the momentum to zoom back up to altitude. Japanese doctrine forced the pilots to attack their enemy no matter the circumstances, so they would climb up slowly only to be dived on and attacked again. There was no way they could escape because a P-38 would outdive them too. So the tactics used were better suited to the enemy and aircraft the P-38 faced in the Pacific compared to Europe. The P-38 Lightning is estimated to have shot down around 1,800 Japanese aircraft during World War II. This makes it the US Army Air Force's most successful fighter of the Pacific.